Thank you, everybody, for coming back. And we will now have our final session of the morning, which goes until noon. We'll have a lunch outside at noon and then reconvene at 1, just to remind you of the schedule. I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel and then be out of your hair until 1 o'clock. We have a great moderator for this panel as well on intelligence sharing in a multipolar world, Dina Temple-Raston from NPR. We're thrilled to have her. She'll be moderating a discussion with Paula Doyle, who's an adjunct professor here at Georgetown, with Dustin Gard-Weiss, who's the director of the Office of Geospatial-Intelligence Management at NGA, Josh Kerbel, who's a member of the faculty at National Intelligence University, and finally Gordon Muir, who's an Australian senior liaison from the Australian Geospatial-Intelligence Organization to the NGA. So please welcome this panel. Over to you, Dina.
For those of you who have never seen me before and actually hearing my voice come out of this body, please feel free to close your eyes if it makes you feel more comfortable. I'm used to that. It happens a lot. And thank you very much for coming. And we have a really cool panel here. I think you're going to be really interested by what they have to say. And I wanted to start right away with a little bit of news. And I wanted to sort of talk to you, Dustin, to start with about this. So we saw in the paper this morning that the Russians are conducting some military training in Belarus or along the border with NATO. And I wonder if you can talk as geospatially, what might we have seen 10 years ago? Would we have seen that they were, in fact, below a threshold of 13,000, so didn't need to have foreign observers? Or what would we have seen then, and how has that changed with what we might be able to ascertain from an intelligence perspective now?
Yeah, so I'd say that in that 10 years or even beyond, the geospatial or geospatial information has changed dramatically, right? So not all that long ago, the sort of pictures from space, if you will, were in the hands of a few sort of nation states, and there were a few capabilities. They were in the hands of a few, and we had confidence in that data. Now, with commercial space industry, or actually I think this is the 10th anniversary of the iPhone, right? So if you think about the explosion of information and sources that present itself, that are now in the hands, right, of not just a few nation states, but are now in the hands of each of us. That changes, I think, changes the landscape pretty dramatically, and it changes the landscape in terms of the information that's not only in the public domain and the conversations that we're having, but also about the narrative. And so I'd say that there are more than just the intelligence community who are looking at exactly that issue, and that information is in the hands of many more organizations and entities than I'd say at any time in the past.
So instead of being a picture issue or a visual issue, does it become a big data issue because you have this much information and you need to analyze it and make it small enough to understand?
So I'd say yes. I'd say that as it's almost in the past it was trying to find the data. Now there's more data than we frankly can manage and handle. And I think the panel before this addressed sort of some of the challenges with big data. So now it's sort of the capabilities between sort of nation states or commercial and sort of our allies and adversaries, so that divide is beginning to close, or that gap is beginning to close. And so the advantage, I believe, becomes the ability to actually synthesize all of that information and create insight faster and more accurately than our adversaries and others are able to do.
And so just to finish this thought about Russia and Belarus, what would be the big seismic change in the way that information would be coming in now that would be different from, say, 5 years ago if they were doing the exact same military maneuvers?
Yeah, so I think that, let's think about social media, right? That's a relatively new phenomenon. As I said, sort of in the last few years, sort of the commercial space, right, and that information that's in the public domain, differently than it was before. I think that there's also history, whether it be Crimea and others, that have caused us to look at information and the pedigree of information in different ways, and the various sources that come together to create the insight that enable our decision makers and our own national security interests to be advanced.
And just turning to you, please, about Australia. Can you talk a little bit how much things have changed for you?
Yeah, sure. So I'll Cast back to, say, 2000, when there's a small nation to the north of Australia called East Timor. At the time, it was part of Indonesia. And they had a decision to become their own nation. A lot of internal violence, a lot of torching of the capital, Timor. And at the time, there were reports from on the ground, but you didn't have the access to the range of sensors that you do today, particularly commercial sensors. Sharing your military or national capability is not always palatable, but you do need to communicate with not just your own population, but other nations to convince that there is a problem. And in that case, there was a UN mission to assist with stability in that nation. At the time, there were very few commercial providers that had the resolution and the access that was useful in telling that story. But there were a few, and if we, as a defence force, weren't as perhaps unified at that time as we are now. We didn't understand geospatial capability in the way that we do now. And we had actually various parts of the defence organisation trying to buy the same data from the same vendor who would happily offer to do that. This was before smartphones. You didn't get photography from the ground too often, and if you did, getting it out via the internet was almost unheard of because your dial-up modem just probably wasn't going to cut it. Fast forward now, we have dozens of commercial providers who have regular access, highly capable sensors, and they will sell them to you at quite a reasonable rate. So rather like the US experience, the onus is on us presently to understand the breadth, the strengths, and the cost-price benefit of what's on offer and to provide advice to our nation. Do we invest a small number of select sensors to collect and provide information, or do we choose a sometimes cheaper, faster, more widely shareable media with commercial provision? And that just extends into every other data set that you can see on the internet currently.
Might I follow up on just one facet? The shareability, and I know that gets to sort of the theme of the panel. The sharing restrictions and opportunities are different, right? So you know, when it's a national sensor that's collecting it, we control, right, and have the ability to decide how we share and with whom we share. Commercial, very different, right? Very different in terms of contractual limitations as well as, you know, the limitations or the opportunity that they may have to sell that same data, information, insight, image to others. So I think it really changes the nature of how we need to think about sharing and how we can bring all of the data and all of the information and sources together to greatest effect.
Well, isn't there another overlay on that is because you have commercial data, because you don't know where exactly the data is coming from, you know, we have this problem of fake news, right? We react to things and we're not quite sure if those things actually happened based on some Facebook post. How do you, any of you can jump in here, how do you feel that, Paula, do you want to talk a little bit about that? How do you feel about that aspect of it?
So fake news, this was likely to come up. The fact that so many,
geospatialness. Yes.
the fact that people are out taking images and posting them at random, you know, you can't govern fake news any better than you can govern fake thinking. People are going to post things that fit with their ideas and their motivations and their paranoias. And we as recipients of all of that data are now burdened with trying to figure out what was the motivation of the person that posted this. It's not just about the content. It's about understanding what was the motivation of the person that provided it. So on the national systems, we run into the same issues. There, you know, whether it's denial and deception, you know, certain countries know pretty well what's going on up there in space. They have their own sensors. And so it's not unlike what we've been dealing with in the intelligence community for many, many years, which is I've taken an image of this particular compound in the Martian death ray program. Did they move those trucks there on purpose, or is this really a military maneuver? So, you know, nothing will replace analytic judgment and asking follow-up questions, but I would stress that on social media there tends to be a sense that it's all true. Well, no, it's not. So we need to train ourselves as good consumers to not only look at the content, but to drive at that question of who posted it and what was in it for them.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how's the intelligence community doing at that?
Yeah, I think that there's a sense, a lot of people talk about fake news now, or this whole phenomena that somehow there's a sense that it's new. And certainly I think that it's not, right? Certainly in the intelligence community, even with our own sources of information, right? A good analyst always looks at it with a certain degree of skepticism, right? He knows a little bit about the source, but even then there's times when we find out later that our own exquisite reporting, to use a term that was used earlier, just wasn't right. There are people out there who are trying to deceive us. There's deception in play. And I think that good analysts actually are always thinking that no matter the source of the information, no matter where they're getting it from, they're always looking at it with a certain degree of skepticism about what if this is actually not right? What if there's something here that I'm not being told? So I don't think it's a new phenomena for us.
No, I think it's louder, though. And certainly it's something that we're dealing with on a level that we as journalists are dealing with on a level that we never had to before. Because it is louder. It's not someone that you know they have a certain agenda and you go, okay.
And I think it's true for us as well, right? It is louder because, of course, we're using more of that open source information as it's available. And that is just part of the concern about it.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to add, for NGA, for us, in the geospatial world, right, sort of just looking at that slice of our community, as I mentioned, largely national sensors, right? And so we understood the pedigree of that data very, very well. What we owe, right? And that piece still do. But what we owe our decision makers and those whom we serve and our partners is an understanding of all of the data and the pedigree, right, and the confidence that they should have, we should have, our analysts should have, in those various disparate sources of data that we're now attempting to synthesize, right, to create insights. And so it does. It poses, not to say that it hasn't been an issue before, but it's changed it, and it's certainly amplified, and it is I think much more of a focus of ours, and it has to be, given the diversity and explosion in geospatial related sources across the full spectrum.
So one of the things we're talking about is information sharing, but I also think that there's the other issue that before the Five Eyes at least, had a monopoly on this kind of information to a large extent. And even being able to vacuum up that information, you had some sort of monopoly. But if you look at groups like ISIS, these are people who are using these tools that you used to have as your own in new and different ways. Fly a little baby Radio Shack drone over the building and see where the troops are. Or in a fake news aspect, here is my YouTube channel and it's showing people that Assad is killing people and they should come and stop this from happening. So these are all things that we're dealing with within our world. I just wonder, how does that change the information sharing makeup? And do you spend time sharing what you know is false and say, okay, this is out there, and this is why we know it's not true?
So I think this is you're putting your finger on the crux of something that we're dealing with now in just a huge way in terms of sharing. In the past, for sharing information, always the primary concern was the protection of sources and methods, right? So that's what always had to come to the forefront, the protection of sources and methods. Increasingly, as we're dealing with information that is available to everybody, that is unclassified, that everybody already has, I think the intelligence community is not going to become an unclassified community. We're going to use more unclassified, but I think the imperative for classification is increasingly going to be less about how the information was collected and more about the policy imperatives that will decide whether or not it can be shared in an open sense. So in this sense, I think it's easier for us, so it's easier.
Sorry, can you explain what you mean by policy?
In terms of the things that we want to see happen as a nation, that there are other nations that are allies, usually Five Eyes, right, have similar kinds of policy issues, right? They probably want to see the same outcome that we want to see. So increasingly, the imperative to share is going to, I think, be based upon do they share, do they have a similar kind of end state or objective in mind? And this is just going to be a phenomenon we're going to see over time because the classification imperative and therefore the ability to share is not going to be solely based on protecting sources and methods. Which is why it's going to be almost impossible for us to share with countries that do not share our preferred policy outcomes. But will certainly be easier with countries like the Five Eyes that presumably or most of the time do.
So you feel like information is going to end up being more siloed? Is that the idea?
I don't know if that's the term I would use, but I mean, I think we're going to use it, but it's just going to, and we're going to share it. But everyone's going to have access to it. But the imperative by which we classify it is going to change over time. As we use more unclassified information, it doesn't mean that our output is going to become unclassified. I don't believe that it will. Mm-hmm. But what it means is that our ability to share that outcome as well as the information involved is going to go to whether or not the person or the group that we're sharing it with shares our preferred policy imperative.
I think there are two pieces, right? One, you talked about sort of a sort of Radio Shack UAV, right? And the threat that poses that's different. One of the things we owe our operating forces and our partners and customers and those who rely on us is an understanding, right, of those capabilities that pose a threat or can give insight to our adversaries in terms of their movements, whereabouts, capabilities, et cetera. So that's a piece, and that again, the diversity of capabilities in that regard are very much something that we owe them. But on the piece on the shareability side, I think it compels us to think about a number of things differently. One is it's not necessarily just about the sharing of the image anymore. It's about sharing of the insight. And we have very clear guidance in terms of sharing of the image. Sharing of the insight is interesting, particularly given if it's the amalgamation of a whole host of different things. How do we think about that? The other pieces are the flexibility, right? Largely bilateral relationships, right? Bilateral sharing, which for a time was how we operated. We can't continue to operate in that way. And if we think about how we work and how we fight and how we partner, sort of the overlapping national security interests of our partners and allies, it's ever changing, right? And so we need the flexibility to look at sharing within the US and look at the US, a combination of US partners with maybe a combination of our traditional Five Eyes Commonwealth partners, maybe not all, and then other partners beyond that. And then we've talked about sort of, industry and innovation that's occurring there and the data analytics that are there and academic institutions. And how do we think about bringing all of that together flexibly with an infrastructure? We may have a policy that enables us to share, but we may not have the technology or the means to actually get the information to where it needs to be. And then as we bring in other sources, if a foreign nation is providing information to us, traditionally bilateral, which inhibit our ability to share that insight, right, and share that information with this broader coalition. So I think that does introduce a whole host of challenges in terms of how we operate and what we need to be thinking about going forward.
And these are current challenges or these are future challenges?
Oh, I think they're here today.
Right.
Very much here today. And by the way, they're not necessarily new, right? If we think about sort of historic conflicts and we look back hundreds of years, but I think that they are much more prominent and they are very much here today.
And are you seeing a difference, Gordon?
Yeah, I wanted to rewind maybe 100 years or so. When people talk about the Five Eyes, it's almost like it's a club that was just formed. It wasn't. It was something that started at the...
Can you explain what the Five Eyes are?
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar, the Five Eyes refers to the relationship between the US, Canada, New Zealand, the UK and Australia. And that relationship really stems from more than 100 years of common foes, of the need to rely on each other since World War I against, to overcome existential threats. And it's been a successful partnership because we've had people in harm's way. They've worked together to protect essentially their homelands. And they've found that they have a commonality of ethics, of worldview, of belief systems. And it's continued pretty much unbroken for the last 100 years. And we've revisited different foes, different problems in different ways, but we've applied the same sense of collaborative environment. And it builds on the last. So it becomes a more complex, more mature, closer relationship as you go ahead. That's not limited to those five nations. If you look at the troubles in the Middle East, there are a whole bunch of nations, Anglo, Arabic and beyond, that have an innate interest in seeing peace and stability in that part of the world. Likewise, in Asia, there's many nations that have deep concerns and deep reason to be concerned about what's going on there. Where we have nations that are willing to take a common view and to contribute, that builds trust. And trust underpins data sharing. It underpins everything that we seek to do. So depending on the issue at hand, it might be a five-nation issue, but that's becoming increasingly rare in this world. And I think you'll see that as we become more mature politically and data becomes more easy to move around, and we appreciate the innovation that other nations can provide, both technical and through insight, then you'll see federations grow, which is probably a good sign for us as a world, as a people, and certainly speaks well for the increasingly the expedited development of our understanding of data and knowledge and higher causes.
What do you think, Paula? Is this going to fundamentally change the way we're sharing information?
So I come at this from my, I retired from CIA in December. I'm on the human side of things, and when you're on the human side of things and there's a human being at the far end of the data that you want to share, very broadly, you do think about other things before you go into an auto-share mode. There are responsibilities to that human at the far end of that information. And you do the best you can to separate the information from the source. But there are some real different challenges as well, which have to do both on the counterintelligence side, on the leaking side, on the public nature of information kind of helps protect some of the humans that are helping us and who are well placed in various parts of the world. But nothing truly disguises the single source reporting. The person who's in a meeting where 3 people, where things are not written down, and you ask the source has the chance to ask the key question. So what do you think about that, boss? Where are you heading with this? And the boss doesn't write anything down on a computer, doesn't talk on the phone, he's in a meeting, and the source is there to hear it. That has been challenging since the OSS, and it's going to continue being a challenge. And so from a human perspective, the Five Eyes Consortium is very strong, it is very resilient, it is very highly trusted, but humans does have different rules that govern it, and I think for good reason it will always continue to have different rules that govern it.
Getting back to this idea of the geospatial view that we can see of the world, I think one of the things that I've heard from my sources in the intelligence community is that the concern is that, say, for example, somebody who's our friend to me, a particular country that's, for example, is concerned about Iran and their nuclear capabilities, puts out some sort of picture or some sort of information that indicates that there's been some sort of explosion or there's been an attack. How do you, for me, most of all, I feel like geospatial can help prevent something like that from happening because your own lying eyes will tell you whether or not it's happened. Can you talk about that sort of scenario?
I think that's one of the challenges that we are confronting and need to continue to confront, which really gets to, a picture can be interpreted in a number of different ways. A picture can be manipulated in a number of different ways, and that's part of what we owe our national security decision makers is our insight.
It's not just a picture anymore, right?
Not.
It's not like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
No, it's not. That's exactly my point, right? Okay. Right, and so it's the narrative or the insight that's gleaned from that, and I think that goes back to sort of the people and the automation, and it's how we're creating value, and I think that almost becomes the thing that we need to protect almost more than anything as we go forward, and I think there'll be a tension, right? There'll be a tension, I believe. In let's say that was not accurate, right? That was not an accurate assessment. Our political interest in challenging that publicly, right? And what that may, and we've had this has been historic, right? We've confronted this through a sources and methods lens. But I don't think it's going to be largely in the geospatial arena about the sources and methods, largely, right? I believe there will absolutely continue to be, amazing things that we can do with our national assets. Absolutely, and the same thing across all the full spectrum. But there's also an amazing amount that can be done in the commercial and open and big data arena, and we're going to have that's going to be a tension, I think, that we're going to have to continue to work through.
How are we doing on that, Josh?
Well, so this is the fundamental issue that I think the IC is dealing with today, is that our formative experience was one where the problem set was a denied area, and if you wanted to know what was going on inside of it, i.e. the Soviet Union, you needed classified collection. Increasingly, so everything we do in our community is primarily, first and foremost, based around collection, and I'm an analyst, so you can see where I'm going with this. We really were second-class citizens, and it kind of made sense, because if we didn't have the information from the collection system, there was nothing for us to work with, right? So that's where we came from, and now we're dealing with a world where the issue is not how do you get the information. Now we're dealing with a world with how do you make sense of the information. We've gone from a problem where we never had enough information, we always wanted more, to a problem where we're now drowning in information. And the question is how do you make sense of it? And this has kind of tossed us on our head, right? Because now we get to our value proposition, as Dustin touched on, right? There was a time when we walked into the room, we were the only ones. If there was anything to know on the topic, chances are we were the only ones who were going to know it. But today, when we walk into the room with a policymaker, the bar is so much higher in terms of what they already know.
Or think they know.
Or think they know from outside information that's available to them, right? They're all over the internet, right? They can be looking at unclassified imagery and any number of things. And our value proposition is increasingly not having this discrete information, but how do you add insight? How do you add value to that? And I think it's interesting, and that NGA organizes this conference. It's great because they're kind of on the cutting edge of this, right? This is an organization that at a time, as the Director Cardillo mentioned earlier, they had a monopoly on this kind of information, and now they don't. And it's a symptomatic problem, though, for the entire intelligence community. It's not a collection issue anymore. It's really now a cognition issue. And I don't think that it's one that we're really quite prepared, or that it's happening so fast that we're not quite sure how to do it, and you end up trying to shoehorn it into your existing processes in some way, and it's an awkward fit.
And our advantage used to be in collection, and now we have to switch our advantage to, our being the United States government, switch our advantage to analysis as opposed to collection. Is that
I think
is that
so.
right?
It's, can we think about it in a way that we can really derive value from it, and in a way that's faster and allows our policymakers to act sooner than others might be able to. There's automation involved in that to a degree, but at the end of the day, it does go down to, can you make sense of this massive information, which is just constantly growing? Just the stream of inputs is massive.
Are you having the same problem in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the US has an enormous population. A nation like Australia's around about 25 million. We are exposed to essentially the same swath of data resources, but we have far less people to point at it. So I think, as Josh was saying, the collection issue is largely going away. There's more information than we can possibly consume. The challenge is, how do you understand those various streams for what they're worth against different issues? How do you process it in a way that doesn't require a doubling every 2 years of your analytic workforce, and present information to your analysts, to your political masters, and to the public in a way that makes sense, and that you can put your hand in your heart and say, this is how sure I am of this detail. There's a lot of challenges there, and it's going beyond what humans can do. It's getting into machine-human pairing, and that's a big part of where most of the community is heading, and the commercial world. I think the world's cottoned on that we're in a data arms race, or information arms race, against ourselves, and time's just pushing us on.
Did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, I mean, we're in a sort of a manual, people-intensive business, right? If you're talking about looking at an image, and that's part of what we need to, and that was talked about earlier. That's where we need to employ and enable our people to focus where they're of greatest value, right? And leverage technology and automation and machine learning and AI. And on the previous panel, there was discussion of, the technology isn't the issue. I still think it is, right? Because I can see it, but we're not actually incorporating it, right? From an enterprise standpoint as well as.
So you're a pro-AI guy? You think artificial intelligence is right?
Absolutely has a role. Absolutely has a role. And I think that the innovation and sort of the value proposition in industry, right, sort of from a financial standpoint, is driving a lot of that, to be sure, and bringing that in is critical. But I also, and I think Anthony talked about this before, which is technology, absolutely, but there's culture and there's process and practice and policy that isn't keeping up and isn't keeping pace with not only what we can do, but what we're going to be able to do and anticipate in the future. And as I mentioned earlier, the technology that doesn't enable us only to create value from that, but also to share that value, right? Flexibly, right? A flexible architecture that enables us to move that information or data that's resident in the cloud, right? To be able to access that securely, right? And to be able to maintain that, the pedigree and confidence of those sources.
Right. I don't want to get too far down the artificial intelligence versus live analyst rabbit hole, but because that's something we've been discussing for some time. But where do you see, where's the sweet spot of that? Do we know where it is?
For artificial intelligence?
But yeah, and analysis and working through these sorts of problems that we have if we have so much information, but.
Look, nothing's going to replace understanding a country. So sometimes these conversations become their own topic and I'm concerned that they become the reason that we don't then, stop what we're doing, go back to learning the basics about Russia and Syria. No amount of data analytics are going to teach our analysts if they have not already been exposed to the long history of Russia's ambitions to their south and to their east. You can put all the right algorithms together and arrive at some answer, but without historic context, without nuanced understanding of a culture and what drives it and makes it tick, I don't know how to program that. And with all due respect to Watson, there's just so much. When I think back through my career and the times when an analyst has taken a bold, different position, that was brought about by a different thought process, by a different experience with data. And I think our challenge is to bring the data together to make the analysts see things, but to not replace that with knowing history and people and nuances of human behavior. So that's where I would go. I'm cautiously optimistic about AI. I think that there are some technology advances coming that will cause more data to find each other, and I do this a lot. Smart data does this kind of stuff, right? And I'm also a lip reader, so I also sign. So this is smart data. But you have to have underlying fundamental understanding of what you're talking about and what the decision maker's advantage for the day needs to know. And that's fast.
I was just going to say, since you're an analyst, this is the perennial.
Getting to this analytical issue, I think rule number one we have to keep in mind is anything that can be automated is going to be automated with time. So AI.
Can I just stop you for a second and say that you never said before this audience that you're speaking in your private capacity as opposed to?
Yes.
Would you like to say that?
Yeah, we never had a good opportunity for that. Yes. Okay. So the opinions that I'm expressing here today are not necessarily those of the National Intelligence University, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government.
Yeah, we want to keep you promotable, but go ahead.
I think I'm not promotable already, but we're past that.
Don't blame me.
This issue, though, so things that can be automated are going to be automated. And I think AI is going to play a huge role in the future of how we do analysis. But the thing that we're not going to be able to automate is going to be creative thinking. So most analysts have been brought up to be exactly that. They've been brought up to be analysts, right? It derives from the Greek, meaning to break things down. That's what we were trained to do, right? To slice them and dice them every which way, and we have traditionally done that pretty well. Now computers are able to increasingly do that well. The value added of the person in the analytic loop now is going to go to a word that Dustin used, and that is it's going to be the ability to synthesize, which just means it's going to be the ability not to necessarily analyze, but to take this broad mass of information and to put it together in new and interesting ways that truly provide us insight about what is happening. And creative thinking it's interesting to think about the terminology, but it is not something that the IC in general has traditionally valued. We've valued critical thinking, right? We have valued good rule-based logical thinking. A good analyst will be able to tell you that this is likely to lead to this, is likely to lead to that, and bring you to a likely outcome. Now we're not talking about those kinds of predictions, really. We're in a world where predictions defy us. It's inherently unpredictable because it's so complex. And in this kind of world, you have to think about possibilities. And to think about those possibilities requires creative thinking. So if it's not for the students in the audience who haven't done a lot of metacognition, who haven't had an opportunity to think about thinking, and haven't had an opportunity to think about what kind of thinkers you are, I would encourage you to spend some time on this topic and really think not just about the subject matter you're interested in, like if you're interested in Russia or if you're interested in China, but to think about yourself, be a little introspective and think about the thinking piece of it, and what kind of thinker are you, and do what you can, and there's a lot you can do to cultivate that creative side, because that's what the IC is going to desperately require in the future, and I think we have a dearth of it right now.
Right, and one of the ways to inspire that creative thinking is actually not to only study China or Russia.
That's right. That's right. To be a T-shaped individual as opposed to an I-shaped individual. Right. You need to have expertise, but you need to have a broad swath that allows you to sort of tie it together and connect it with other things.
In a way that maybe nobody else will. I want to start going to questions that we've gotten from the audience, and I'm going with the best handwriting first. That seemed like the best way to do it. So, so I think this is from Monty, unless your handwriting is not very good. And Monty's asking, how can the IC leverage the potential of blockchain to increase or improve confidentiality, integrity, availability, i.e. the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data? Just, I'll jump in at once. Go ahead.
Okay.
So explain blockchain first. So people
Yeah,
understand.
that's dangerous. So the reason I smiled is that I realized I was old a few months ago when I heard someone talking about quantum crypto blockchain for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And please feel free to correct me. My understanding, a blockchain essentially is a bunch of code that proves provenance and custody of information from its creation till when you receive it. So it essentially tells you.
It's like an international ledger that has so many copies, theoretically, you're not able to change it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that theoretically is entirely applicable to something where you own the sensor and you own the networks across which the data flows. My gut feeling is that if you don't control those two components of the transmission, blockchain is very hard to apply. Maybe you can pick something up and through some way verify it yourself through other means as to its validity and then apply a blockchain methodology. But beyond that, I think you're going to be challenged to apply to all resources.
I agree with you.
That it's too hard to apply.
No, that if you don't own all of the infrastructure through which your blockchain transaction takes place, there are ways to pierce into it.
It goes back to what I mentioned before. It gets back to the confidence in the data, right? And so as yes, there's some data, right, that we have the ability to.
But isn't that what blockchain's supposed to be all about? Is that because there are so many copies, you have confidence in the data?
But it goes back to the point that Gordon mentioned, right? So if you own isn't necessarily, I'm not going to use that term, but if you control those pieces, then I think that it works pretty well. But it goes to the vulnerabilities that Paula mentioned if you don't. It also goes to relationships with partners that we're going to have to think about, right? Which is it's not just the data itself, right? But it's some level of assurance or confidence of varying degrees in all of the facets from, and I'll use sort of the collector, right, to the person, right, to the person who's actually looking at it, and everything, right, and every step along that way.
Or to make it a more grounded example, you know where every chip in the computer came from.
Yes.
essentially the information version.
And every router and every piece along the path, right? That you know every fiber.
And right. It's way more than the pieces.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that?
I'm certainly no expert in this, but I'm skeptical on some level because what we're dealing with when we're dealing with code and all this information is we're really essentially dealing with organic systems, systems that behave like organic systems. And many people in the audience will remember in the movie Jurassic Park, where the chaos theorists, they think that they have fenced it, right? They think they have a handle on it, that these things can't procreate, right? It's not going to be possible. But organic systems, nature finds a way, and as they said in the movie, and it's drawn from real live science, right? We're dealing with organic systems, and it finds a way. And you have to think about it that way. I've seen too many sort of examples of code in a lab that's going to stay in the lab and it's not going to get out or it's not going to become something different that it does.
Right. Well, I think
so I have
also,
a certain degree of skepticism just because of the chaos science behind it.
well, there's a more fundamental problem too. We're putting on my increasingly cyber hat that I have rather than counterterrorism hat. Code is bad. Code doesn't, there is no such thing as an infallible code. And coders, the reason why you keep having to have updates on your Microsoft Word or whatever it is you're using is because coders made a mistake and they need to fix it. And it's intrinsically that way. And I mean, blockchain may work some of those kinks out, but I think that that's the fundamental problem, is that coding is not perfect. So next question from Jim Dubik, who's here at Georgetown. And this is a good question. This is one I was going to ask as well. How is intel sharing changing between military and defense and law enforcement agencies, both domestic and international? Particularly since I live in New York, NYPD is a really good example of that tension. And how is it changing among allies and coalition partners in a world, as we've been talking about, all these sources of information?
Again? Okay.
Yeah. Start with Australia.
So maybe a decade ago, we made a distinction or decision, the government made a decision we had an intelligence community and we had a national intelligence community. And they decided to bring people like our border protection people, customs, our federal police, which is sort of the FBI equivalent, inside the tent into that community to basically say to all present, you all work for the nation, we have limited resources and therefore we want you to share and cooperate as best you can to take forward the national interest. That's gone quite well. It's certainly empowered a lot of arms of government that were perhaps previously working in a little bit of an information vacuum. However, you can't share everything. The pressure on clearance, as Director Cardello mentioned, doesn't allow everyone to have a common understanding and appreciation for the sensitivity of all data that's made available. And in particular, there are some resources and methodologies that you don't want to get into evidential process. You don't want in a public court to be using a national capability to prosecute someone for drugs or whatever it is and have to justify how it is that they did this and this and this. So I think there's a natural tension between wanting to promote the rightful use of the apparatus of government, but there's some realities about burning your bridges to address minor or lesser issues.
But this is a question of just dragging branches behind your footsteps, right? So you say you should go and look at, that's a journalistic term, by the way. We drag branches behind our footsteps all the time to protect sources. But so you could say, this gentleman is a good gentleman to start looking in on, or this group is a good group to sort of take a look at.
That certainly occurs. But it might be the first nudge in a certain direction or a suggested line of investigation that not all the detail might necessarily be suitable for evidence.
I think that's a great point, because it also gets to mission, right? And so what information do you need in order to advance and support that mission? So Director Cardello mentioned, the support that we're providing to FEMA, sort of from a lead, we need a lead federal agency in terms of working within the U.S. And the support that we're providing to FEMA is a great example, right, of the value in that partnership relative to FEMA's mission and an intelligence community agency providing that information insight, and the Arctic was another example. And it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of sort of coalition and broader partnerships. We just need to be thoughtful, right? And we need to think through the sharing in the same way that we've thought about it before. But the dynamic is different, right? Because of the vast amount of information and types of information that can and should be shared. And so is it facilitating the sharing, or expanding a contractual relationship with a commercial provider to expand that to be able to ensure that, right, that commercial data and information is provided? Or is it, or the picture, or is it about the insight, right, or the data analytics, or is it about the classified national capabilities? And so I think that there are more ways that we can share than we've necessarily been able to share in the past, particularly from a geospatial standpoint.
Well, just building on that, we were talking briefly about doves and planet.com.
Yeah.
Doves seems to me like something that can solve a lot of problems, not necessarily for the intelligence community, but certainly for people who are trying to understand what's going on in the world. That if you have small drones, maybe with not terrifically good optics, floating over Darfur 10 years ago when I was in Darfur and we couldn't find a janjaweed, but we found all these smoking villages, that would have been a tremendous help. It also, though, has this tension that you have this information that is out there and maybe is weaponized. So how do we find a weaponized, either from an information sense or something bigger, how do we find the best defense to something like that?
So I might, kind of going back, is your name Jim?
I'm sorry?
What's the name, Jim?
That was a while ago.
No,
Jim, yes.
Jim, so for Jim, and it segues into your question. Information sharing, I kind of dissected into 3 areas. There's analytic information sharing based on disseminated intelligence and open source information brought by both sides. There's operational information sharing, and I think that's the area that best answers the question, both that you're asking as well as what Jim asked, how have things changed? And the third area is science and technology and R&D. There are exchanges across partnerships on these levels worldwide, all the time. What I think has driven the difference, especially on the operational end, is that we, after 9/11, entered the great age of counter. We have counter-proliferation. We have to stop proliferation. When we know that there is equipment going to a weapons program and we can put a date-time stamp on the movement of something, we have an obligation to stop it. We have treaty obligations and we have national interest obligations to stop it. Counterterrorism, wow, we could talk for hours about that. Counter-narcotics, counterintelligence, counter-cyber. Cyber is going to massively change the way we have information exchanges with both allies and enemies. The notion of introduction of technologies to help people, I think, is really aimed at not only knowing the world, but what are you going to do about it? The policy objectives today, the decision advantage is coming not so much in knowing what's going on. It's a mess out there. What are we, Team America, Team Australia, Team Five Eyes, Team whatever? Think about all those coalition partners working in the Levant right now. The real prerogative is, what do we do about it this hour, this day, this week, and on my tour? Say nothing about during my presidency, which is a luxury to think about a 3.5-year time frame. But we can't forget the strategic piece of it while we're looking at the here and now.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and we've covered a wide range of topics when it comes to information sharing. I wonder if each of you can just briefly say, what's the thing you believe people should take away from this particular panel, the new sort of nugget of understanding that they should take away, that they can write a paper at Georgetown about?
You're looking my way.
I am. You're first.
I'm first. I think it's both the opportunity and the challenge, right? So the amazing opportunity that the proliferation of geospatial sources presents, and the ability to synthesize all of that information to insight, but also the danger and the challenge and the threat that it poses, because our adversaries are looking at it the same way that we are. They're trying to create advantage for their own decision makers to ensure their primacy. And so we just need to, those are the two things that I think about, the two takeaways for me.
So that's the essay topic.
Yeah.
Okay. How about for you, Josh?
So for me, I think that in a lot of ways, the intelligence community still suffers a problem with recognition of the problem. We talk about a lot about it, right? And you hear it here, and we're honestly different bits and pieces of the IC are wrestling with this idea of this need to share more, to be more integrated with the outside world, to not be so closed and insular. But in a lot of ways, I think we're still a community that is sort of like at the beginning of a 12-step program, but we haven't really taken that first step, right? We're having a hard time. We'll say, yes, it's important that we share more. It's important that we integrate with the outside community more. But we don't really have a problem as is. It would be good, but we don't really have that much of a problem. And I think we're wrestling with the nature of a world, right? We're used to dealing with problems that you could deal with by narrowing in on them. You knew what the problem was, you knew where to look, and you could focus on them. And the thing about a complex, interconnected world is you can't. You have to think about it much more broadly. And the intelligence community is existing organizational constructs, it's existing metrics for success, it's existing behavioral constructs, it's cognitive constructs. All of these, in many ways, are still just manifestations of how we've always done it. So if you're looking for essay topics, we're just a ripe community with places to pull on, but fundamentally we have to get at this issue of why do we have to open up to the rest of the world? Why do we have to do this? There are people who understand that, but I think overall as a culture we don't.
It's a great essay topic. That'll get an A.
There's lots of pieces to it, and I'm happy. I'll be here all day, and people want to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about it with you. But
He'll
I
help you
think
through that outline. That should be easy.
Is that there's still a fundamental recognition. The world is different today. It is not what we grew up with in terms of our formative experience, and there's all kinds of ways we need to do things differently.
Your essay topic?
My essay topic would be that the future, automation is part of our future, but it is not a future devoid of human responsibility. And that although we need to let go a little bit to allow machines to do the stuff that we can no longer do ourselves, there are many things that a machine will never be able to do. That ethical, intellectual, conceptual development has to maintain. You can never rely on a button that everyone's just going to push because it gives you the answer. That answer will shift over time. And that threat, that risk is emphasised when you consider the capacity for others to manipulate the information going into your algorithm if they understand it. And it also leads back to the responsibility we have to expect change and to adapt. And that's something that most machines can't do, probably won't be able to do. So bring machines in, but maintain the human presence because it's central to a safe future.
And Paula?
I'm going to take this in a little different direction, and I would urge at least a few of you to be thinking about the notion of privacy versus compartmentation, privacy versus sharing. And I'm not talking just about the intelligence community. I'm talking about fundamental First Amendment, fundamental Fourth Amendment, fundamental Sixth Amendment challenges we faced in the 21st century. You are going to be shaping an entirely different environment, those of you who enter the community or who enter academia or are in industry supporting national security issues. We have not had a thoughtful conversation about the right tipping point and balance, and it confuses and unnerves our allies who are having similar conversations based on ethics, based on law, based on tradition. And I think we really need a few more people in the academic world to help us struggle through this. Our Congress is struggling through it. Our judiciary is struggling through it. And the intelligence community does not thrive when lawmakers disagree and when the judiciary disagrees. We do not and cannot thrive in a democracy on that level. So that's how I would leave you today.
Excellent. Well, the only thing standing between you and lunch is applause for our panel. Thank you very much.